Good evening. Welcome to the American Voter Project at the Eric Holder Jr. Initiative for Civil and Political Rights. I'm Jelani Cobb, the Ira A. Lipman Professor of Journalism at Columbia University and staff writer at The New Yorker. I'm also a member of the Holder Initiative's Faculty Steering Committee. On behalf of the initiative, I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's talk on the current state of voting rights in the United States. We are joined tonight by a stellar panel of luminaries in the fields of justice and voting rights to help us parse through the historical context of voting rights and, of course, voter suppression, and how we find ourselves in this moment where the most fundamental right is increasingly under siege. We will be joined shortly by Eric Holder himself, and I'm happy to welcome our other panelists in the interim. We are joined by Heather Gerkin, who is the Dean of Yale Law School, as well as the Saul and Lillian Goldman Professor of Law. Dean Gerkin is one of the country's leading experts on constitutional law and election law. She's also a founder of the Nationalist School of Federalism, and her work focuses on federalism, diversity, and dissent. Next up, we have Neil Volz, who serves as the Deputy Director of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. He has more than 25 years of experience working as a public servant and community advocate. His previous work includes serving as the Chief of Staff for a member of Congress and Staff Director for a full congressional committee. And finally, we are proud to welcome back another alumnus, Michael Waldman, of Columbia College class of 1982. And I have the pleasure of having interviewed Michael previously for my own project on voting rights, the documentary film Whose Vote Counts. He is the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University School of Law, a nonpartisan law and policy institute that focuses on improving systems of democracy and justice. The Brennan Center is a leading national voice on voting rights, money in politics, criminal justice reform, and constitutional law. And Mr. Waldman, who is a constitutional lawyer and writer, is an expert on the presidency and American democracy. He's led the center since 2005. I also highly recommend his book, The Fight to Vote. And in addition, while I'm giving out plugs, the Brennan Center is indispensable resource for people who are interested in questions relating to these matters and many more. And so a visit to their website would be well worth your time. So I want us to jump right into this. The fight for voting rights is more vital today than it's ever been. And we're happy to have you to engage in this discussion, set against the backdrop of the Supreme Court nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson and her Senate confirmation hearing, which been interesting. Yesterday's Supreme Court ruling on Wisconsin's state legislative maps, which I hope we can get into as well. I'd love to open the conversation with a question about the High Court. And I see that Eric Holder is joining us now. And so we will anticipate that. And there you are.
Sorry, I'm late. I had some technical issues.
Okay, is that a Zoom background? Or are you coming from us? Are you literally standing in front of Columbia University's library? As
I'm actually standing on South Field and looking at, no, I'm actually, that's a Zoom background.
Okay, well, we're happy to have you with us. And if I left this out at the beginning, Attorney General Holder is also a fellow native of Queens, as I am. Recent studies have indicated a statistical preponderance of the greatest people in the world being Queens natives. So
Absolutely.
This is now empirically proven.
And it's 100% correct.
100% correct. So we wanted to jump in with a question about the High Court, just kind of starting there and moving outward in the discussion. In the last decade, and especially in recent months, we've witnessed the ascendancy of a US Supreme Court, as well as several circuit courts, namely the Fifth, that are openly hostile to voting rights and meaningful redistricting reform. If the federal judiciary is increasingly hostile to democracy, Could state court litigation offer more promising returns on investment? And are there factors that would make a state court approach less appealing than continuing to litigate in a hostile federal system? Can I ask that question? I hate to drop this on you just as you walk in. Can I ask that question of Attorney General Holder and also of Michael?
Sure. Well, I don't think there's any question that the federal courts generally, although to be fair, I'm not at all certain that I can cast too wide a net here, because federal district courts and a fair number of federal appellate courts have proven, I think, receptive to appropriate voting protection claims. The Supreme Court has almost uniformly been a problematic place. What we have done at the National Democratic Redistricting Committee that I'm the chair of is move our focus to the state courts, where we have found a much more receptive environment to claims that I think are not really on the edges, or not on the extreme. I mean, just really solid claims. We've seen that in Ohio, in North Carolina, in Pennsylvania, and so that is where we are bringing a lot of our litigation. So I think that, and it is what, if you look at that the opinion of the court, the Supreme Court, they held out as an option, said, all right, we're not going to get involved, for instance, in partisan gerrymandering cases, but you can bring them in state courts. Now, we'll see if they are consistent with that suggestion. But yeah, we have found the state courts to be places where these claims can, in fact, be adjudicated and I think in an appropriate way.
Mm-hmm. Michael.
Yes, that's exactly right. Especially we're seeing that this year, as the federal courts and the Supreme Court has proven so hostile in so many different ways to the claims of voters, whether on voting rights cases or redistricting cases. And it is not only a strategic choice or a second best option in some respects, in that state constitutions, many of them were written with a very strongly pro-democracy majoritarian bias, in a way the federal constitution only stumbled toward over the years. All but one state constitution, for example, has an explicit protection for the right to vote, stronger than anything in the federal constitution. So you see in cases, as Attorney General Holder mentioned, the Brennan Center was one of the litigants in the Ohio litigation, where we represented Black and Muslim voters, and the state Supreme Court 3 times now has struck down the maps in that state. There are downsides, of course. In different ways, state courts are susceptible to pressure, electoral pressure, dark money. There is a move to impeach the Republican state Supreme Court Chief Justice in Ohio precisely because of these rulings. But it's an interesting and in many ways an exciting development. I think, though, that it's important to not lose sight that there are just times where national standards and the federal constitution and action by the national government really is necessary when states are abusing the rights of their people. I do continue to think that that is a moment we're at as well.
Mm-hmm. I want to point out, though, with regard to the federal courts, I think we need to be more granular in this analysis. If you look at, for instance, the case we brought, in Alabama, the Section 2 case, 4 judges considered that case in Alabama, 3-judge panel, district court judge, all of them found for the plaintiffs, for us. It was a Supreme Court through a procedural mechanism that essentially at best delayed what those judges said should occur, 2 of whom were Trump appointees, and at worst are going to use this as an opportunity to potentially gut Section 2. The same thing when it came to the partisan gerrymandering claims that were put before the court. If you look at all the federal judges who looked at that case, it was the 5 justices, in stark contrast to the other judges and 4 justices who found there was not a basis for federal jurisdiction for those kinds of claims. So I think the place where a lot of these cases, these claims go to die, is not necessarily in the appellate courts. Fifth Circuit might be a little different, not necessarily the appellate courts or the district courts, but the place where they go to die is the United States Supreme Court.
I want to take a step back just a little bit and start with maybe a round robin with each of you, laying out what you see as the landscape of voting rights right now and electoral participation, and what the most significant concerns are. What are the things that when you look out and see, what is going on in terms of legislation, in terms of litigation, in terms of policy and practice, the things that make you raise an eyebrow or keep you up at night. If we go in order of Neil, Heather, Michael, and Eric.
Well, one, I'm already enjoying this conversation. This is fantastic. So from my perspective, and again, I'm not a legal scholar, right? So I'm a political practitioner. I have some bookends of experience that bring me into this conversation. I remember being on the floor of the House of Representatives January 7th, 2001, as we were going through this process of people questioning whether they could certify the election of Florida, right, where I live. And it was rancorous. We had a Supreme Court decision and the politics were really nasty. I ended up being charged with leading the staff at the congressional committee that wrote the Help America Vote Act in response to that moment. That's when I really became a democracy activist. We got 90 votes in the Senate. We got almost 400 votes in the House for substantive changes to move democracy forward. The other piece of my story is I'm a returning citizen. I'm somebody with a felony conviction. So I worked here in Florida in 2018 to help us pass Amendment 4, which restored voting rights for 1.4 million people in the state of Florida. It's the largest expansion of democracy we've seen in the country in 50 years. And it was led by people who were impacted by the criminal justice system. And so I've seen kind of the best of times and worst of times. And I actually believe that some of our challenges are ultimately cultural. Like, how do we talk to each other? How do we build bridges to continue to focus on democracy itself and the sacredness of democracy versus these kind of tribal conversations that we seem to be having, this inability to recognize truth and fact. And so I think that those are conversations that surround this kind of the legal discussion. And that's a little bit more where I'm comfortable discussing, because I think that we have real challenges around whether people even see us as a country bound together by laws or not. And so we've got a long way to go to protect this thing we call democracy.
Neil, we're going to circle back to you because I have some specific questions about Florida I want to get into with that. But Heather?
If I had to name the top 3 threats to our democracy at this moment, I would say polarization, polarization, and polarization. So I think just to pick up on what Neil just said, our system is built on the assumption that there is a sensible center, that there's a give and take in politics, that we trust one another to carry out basic activities like election administration. We saw Bush v. Gore was a long time ago compared to where we are now, and even that put a fair amount of pressure on the system. But at this moment, with the extraordinary level of not just skepticism, but enmity between the two political parties, the way that people look at one another and their willingness to just grab power and subvert the sort of traditional process of running elections. It is the first time in a long time. I feel like election law professors like myself, we've often been the people who want to calm everyone down, tell everyone don't worry, everything is fine, be sort of very dispassionate about it. But I think this is a moment when there's a quiet conversation happening among election law professors expressing real worry that the system is there's so much pressure on the system. It is a clunky system at best, and that we could see it break at some point as if we keep moving forward in this fashion.
What's interesting is, and I've talked with my students at the journalism school about this, about how Washington in his farewell address, when he cites all the variety of potential threats to the young republic, he talks about sectionalism, which we see how that turned out in 1861 to 1865, and kind of accurately called it. But the thing that appeared to be off, was that he said that partisanship, or what he called factionalism, would be a danger as well. And, that seemed for the majority of American history to have been, overblown. But we see in this moment that we're experiencing exactly the sort of thing that he was talking about. Do you hazard, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but can you hazard a guess as to how this and why this exploded now at this particular moment of all times?
there's a lot of really good political science on this question. So there's a group that traces it to inequality, and that's the reason for growing levels of polarization. There's a group that traces it to the realignment of the political parties in a way that's cleaner and closer to what they do. And then there's another group that traces it to social media and the crazy media environments in which we exist that amplify untruths in an instant and are built to rile people up. So there's a big debate about them, but whatever the sources are, the system isn't built for it, and it cannot take this kind of pressure. And we are, I think, really at a place where there's a possibility that there's chaos at every election. I mean, Michael knows this. I suspect Neil does as well. Anyone who's ever litigated or I was in the Obama boiler room in 2008 and 2012, at that moment that there's a messy system out there where things are falling apart in different parts of the system, just because the system isn't run particularly well, let alone when people are actually trying to deliberately manipulate it. In that kind of environment, you really need people to be able to take a step back and to not sort of charge in and seize power in the way that you really are seeing an impulse among it. So there's just a worry that we just aren't even able to take the usual bumps of running an election system, let alone what we're seeing now, which is that partisans are putting a lot of pressure on the system just in the way that they're sort of passing laws in order to advantage their own partisan purposes, which is a longstanding tradition, but it has become quite extreme.
Mm-hmm. Like the kind of forbearance of, I'll go this far, but no further. I won't do the thing that damages my opponent at risk of damaging the system itself.
Yeah, I mean, we used to have, I think, what would be called a loyal opposition, and
the
question is whether we've gone past the point of having a party system that works in that way.
Michael.
I think it's an interesting thing, because I think in some respects what happened in 2020 was a bipartisan civic triumph, in that despite the pandemic and the lies and voter suppression and other things, but despite the pandemic, we had the highest voter turnout since 1900. And that was the product of election officials of both parties all over the country mobilizing, Congress on bipartisan basis appropriating funds, business as well as labor and churches lining up hundreds of thousands of people to be poll workers because the elderly poll workers were not showing up. It was actually a wonderful moment on a not entirely partisan basis for our democracy. What worries me is what the response was. I think that Dean Gerkin is exactly right, that there's always a lot of politics in politics, and that the polarization has gotten more and more extreme. But I guess I think that the big lie, and the fact that now a former president of the United States continues to aggressively push slander about our election being fake and rigged, and that tens of millions of people believe him, that is the fundamental underlying new fact, at least in recent years. And I think we have a challenge in sort of how to grapple with it, and to assess, is this just kind of more noise, or is this something new, dangerous, distinct, and particularly worthy of concern?
I mean, I think that there's always been a certain purchase that conspiracy theories had in American history, American politics, going back to the 1850s, and even the allegations, swirling around Abraham Lincoln in 1860 that he was actually part Negro, as they would have said back then. I mean, I think we've always had that kind of element. I wonder what's different about the viability and the spread of those ideas. Is it simply social media? Is it being injected into the kind of body politics in this way now? Because if a president had said something like this in previous generations, people might have just thought that he had lost it.
Well, back then in the 1800s, it was before we had the notion of objective media. All the newspapers back then were partisan in one way or the other. There's no doubt that social media and the algorithmic siloing of people makes a difference. But again, there were people who talked about fluoridation of water, or Father Coughlin talking about the Jews, right, but he wasn't the president. So I think that does make a difference. Look, we look at Russia. I look at what's going on in the horrific situation in Russia, and we look at what's going on in Russia itself and say, it's 2022. All these people have access to all this information. How could they possibly believe this is a limited incursion to chase the Nazis out of Ukraine? Yet we have plenty of people in this country who believe equally absurd, if not as deadly things.
Yeah, sure. Eric.
Yeah, I think the thing that keeps me up at night is that a significant portion of one of our two major parties has adopted or is turning its back on democracy and is tending to embrace an authoritarian way of thinking. You know, and this is a hard thing to say. This is a hard thing for me to say. You know, I mean, I always try to go in there into these efforts at the NDRC and other places with the thought that we were simply going to try to do things in a fair way. And I think that, you know, one of the two major parties has made the determination. They see demographics shifting, moving away from them. They see the ideology of this country moving away from them. And they've made the determination that they are going to do whatever it is that they have to try to acquire and maintain power. And so if that means suppressing votes, if it means putting in place unnecessary photo ID laws, if it means racial and partisan gerrymandering, and which is not to say Democrats are not guilty of, you know, gerrymandering, that is true, but you cannot say objectively that Democrats are doing the same things as Republicans are when it comes to keeping Americans away from the polls. And that is the thing that keeps me up. I mean, you know, we can talk about the child tax credit, unbelievably important. We can talk about infrastructure, unbelievably important. The single most important thing confronting the United States of America today is the protection of our democracy. That is under threat. And the thing that keeps me up at night is that one of the two parties, or significant portions of one of the two parties, seemingly is not committed to the notion that they can lose elections, you know, that the people should ultimately decide that is in fact the way our democracy should be carried out. And this notion, I think we too easily, you know, shift into this notion of equivalence. The media is, I think, guilty of it. You know, it's like,
certainly, yeah,
it's raining outside, and so, you know, Democrats say it's raining, Republicans say it's not raining, and the media just reports that. Well, if you're in the media, tell me, is it raining? You know, look outside, tell me, is it raining? And and then, you know, social media obviously puts all of this stuff on steroids. But I think at core, it is really this significant portion, majority portion of the Republican Party that is turning its back on democracy.
Yeah, I mean, there are political scientists now who insist upon referring to the polarization in the country as asymmetrical polarization, in that, you know, Democrats have moved slightly further to the left, but Republicans have moved considerably farther to the right, as something that's driving this. I have two questions for you, but the first is, you know, we've seen this before in the Republican Party in 1964, when Goldwater was the nominee, and he set off alarms throughout the GOP, most notably, you know, Nixon and Reagan, who thought that Goldwater would just be the death knell for the Republican Party. We have not seen, in an effort to kind of push the party in a more moderate direction post Goldwater, we have not seen that sort of response post 2016, post Trump. We've seen a kind of full-throated embrace of it. And I wonder if you could just, even if it's kind of hazarding a guess or a theory about why there has been such a receptive audience on the right to a set of political ideas that would, under normal circumstances, have been thought of as utterly marginal.
It's an interesting question. You know, I'm not sure. I mean, I think you get into sociological things at that point where there is a concern among, you know, white folks in this country that the nation is becoming more brown. Mm-hmm. That we are seeing a movement towards a truly multiracial society, and that means a whole bunch of things. You know, it becomes a multidimensional religious country, and that, in a lot of ways, is frightening to people. You know, institutions, human beings tend to like the status quo unless it becomes unbelievably, you know, unbearable. And this notion of a more brown, more multidimensional religious country can be something that is that is scary. And so when you say, I'm going to make America great again, that takes you back, to a place where, June Cleaver was doing the housework and wearing pearls, takes you back to Leave It to Beaver, whatever. And that's a comforting place. And there's a dynamism. I think to Trump, he's a showman, he's a charlatan and all of that stuff, but there's a part of him that is, that he's not, out of the mold. The blow-haired Washington D.C. type. There's a certain attractiveness there. So I think you combine all of that stuff, and that's why I think you have certain, a substantial number of people in this country who are willing to embrace, I think, pretty extreme positions. And one of the things I'd say before, we talked about people go left and right, and that's true. We've seen that in our history. That's fine. We have progressive eras, we have conservative eras. But we've not seen like the era that we're seeing now, which is a movement away from democracy. And that's the thing, I think, that makes this unique and so frightening.
Mm-hmm. So I wonder, I have a two-part question, and this is admittedly a kind of partisan question and deals with the current administration. So whoever wants to jump in on this, you're open. But if no one jumps in, I'll call on you because I'm a professor. In August of 2021, the Biden administration faced some criticism from leading civil rights advocates for purportedly suggesting that they could, quote unquote, out-organize restrictive voting laws that are being passed in Republican state legislatures. And I wonder, first, is that right? And if is that the case? And secondly, just out of a kind of curiosity about what exactly it would take for any meaningful voting reform legislation to make it through Congress, as we see, the two major bills that have effectively been stalled in Congress, throughout President Biden's term. So whoever wants to jump in on that, the first one being, can you out-organize these restrictive measures?
The White House says they didn't say it, although certainly a number of people I know think they heard them say it. It's sort of who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? But whether they actually said it or not, I do think there's some underlying flaws in the thinking. First of all, it to me is somewhat morally challenging to say, well, just work a little harder, wait on line a little longer, work a little harder to overcome these very carefully calibrated obstacles that people are trying to place in your way. It's also the case that you cannot out-organize a gerrymander. There are built-in structural imbalances, including in gerrymanders, that really are not things that just a little more elbow grease can overcome. But I also think that there's a point that is often missed about the impact of these laws. Look, they're not all these laws are as bad as others. They are, however, carefully targeted in many ways at Black voters, at Latino voters, at Asian and Native voters. And up until recently, the federal courts, as Attorney General Holder said, especially below the level of the Supreme Court, actually blocked or softened many of these worst laws. We have not yet seen the impact of what can happen with these laws. So I think that the White House did eventually see the light, in a sense. I was very involved in trying to pass the Freedom to Vote John Lewis Act. It was, I believe, vitally needed. And we came within 2 votes. It passed the House. It had a majority in the Senate. Of course, the president was willing to sign it. And it came within 2 senators of changing the filibuster rules to enable them to pass. That was very disappointing, but it also shows a lot of progress that was made. So however this issue, which is now at the center of much public debate, however this unfolds, I do think sooner or later there's going to need to be a federal response.
In talking with voting rights activists, Michael, about this, and lots of folk who are in, kind of commentary and policy, Black policy circles, there is a general perception that they view this as an existential threat, and the rest of the Democratic Party views it as a problem. I mean, is that?
I think people feel it very deeply. And again, given the motives behind so many of these laws, I can certainly understand why that is. Mm-hmm. And it's a long-term political challenge for the Democrats if they don't respond to that.
I'm sorry, Heather, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, just in thinking through this, I think one of the, just a thread to add to the conversation is the absence of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which was the crown jewel of the voting system, maybe even the entire, of all the Civil Rights Act. It was one of the most powerful, effective weapons against vote discrimination that was ever invented. And that disconnect that you describe, it may come in part because and this is just there's a mismatch between the interests of the parties and the civil rights groups. Mm-hmm. The Democrats are interested in winning elections where they are likely to win. And so they pour a ton of resources into those areas. So I think Neil can correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember there was a moment in Florida where there were just laws that were being passed that made it so difficult to register people to vote that the League of Women Voters and the Boy Scouts had to drop out. But the Obama campaign, right, had enough resources and training to be able to sort of overcome even that obstacle. But the difference between the two groups is this: the Democrats have enormous resources and they're focused on a select number of races. But if you're actually thinking about the effects on all voters, things that happen at the local level where the races aren't as competitive, where these issues seem smaller when they on the national stage, but really matter to communities inside. And that's what Section 5 was designed to address. Section 5 was able to sort of clean up the really sort of terrible stuff that was happening at the races that the Democrats were not paying attention to, that no one was paying attention to, right? Because they were small, they were local, they were not close, all of those things. I think that gap is we see it more and more all the time. And the absence of Section 5 has just has put a huge burden onto civil rights groups to do the kind of enforcement that the Department of Justice used to do.
Mm-hmm. I think the dean makes a really good point. If you had a viable Section 5 and a viable and concerned Justice Department, that's a whole other story. A lot of these laws certainly would have been challenged by the Justice Department and probably not come into, and I think Justice Department would have won before a 3-judge panel, in DC, whatever. But a substantial number of these laws probably would not have even been attempted to be put into place, knowing that with Section 5, a Washington-based Justice Department would successfully oppose them. And that's the terrible part about the case that bears my name, about the Shelby County case. In essence,
per your request, by the way, I stopped referring to it as the Shelby v. Holder case. I now only refer to it as the Shelby case.
And you heard me, it bears my name, Shelby County. That's as far as I'm willing to go. But the Shelby County case, in essentially taking pre-clearance out of the mix, allowed for all of the substantial portion of the things that we're now dealing with. Chief Justice Roberts talking about America has changed. Yeah, America has changed, but not nearly as much as I think he thought. And that dissent by Justice Ginsburg has proven to be 1,000% prescient.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it struck me in the decision, not to weigh in, but it struck me in reading it that it seemed almost the equivalent of saying drunk driving has plummeted. So let's get rid of the laws prohibiting drunk driving now. Like we've got the message. We don't need those laws anymore. Neil, can you talk to me a little bit about the landscape in Florida? First, the work that your coalition has done in order to restore voter access and the right to vote to people who have convictions, and what has happened subsequent to that, the impediments and where things stand in confronting those impediments.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to even kind of build a bridge to your question before. I mean, I feel like we're in a Dickens novel, right? It's the best of times and the worst of times, especially as it relates to Florida. In 2018, we took a giant leap forward. We had 64% of the voters in a bipartisan manner voted to extend voting rights to people with felony convictions. So you're talking about, bigger than the state of New Hampshire. It's a lot of people who joined the franchise. Then the legislature decided to get involved and put policies in place that force people to pay their financial obligations, including their costs and fees, which are especially egregious in Florida, because that's how the justice system is paid in the state. So you have not restitution, not fines, that are levied as a part of the punishment that you might get from a judge, but the cost of doing business is also tacked on to your requirements to simply engage in the act of voting. So we saw basically in simple numbers, 1.5 million folks jump forward. We ended the lifetime ban for people with felony convictions. By the way, 150-year-old Jim Crow policy that came tumbling down. But then relatively quickly, we saw about 700,000+ of those folks have barriers re-erected to say you can't vote until you have paid your financial obligations. And so to get to your point, like we registered about 100,000 folks in 2020, 40,000 last year. So we're in the business of engaging the community, and this idea that you can out organize, I'm all in. Like we feed our movement on hope. Like we're going to get up every day, put our work boots on and go fight for people. But policies matter, like having headwinds and the chilling effect in Florida of having to, now having, kind of deputized a bunch of law enforcement to get even further into the operations around elections, like the DeSantis administration has been pushing, is really frightening to think about where we're going. We've clearly decided to take a step in the wrong direction, right? Mm-hmm. So but I don't want to be, I think there's a bigger picture here as well when we think about the landscape across the country. I still live in a state in which for 10 days I can go vote in any precinct, I can vote early, and we can mobilize. We have tools to get people out. And I think there's still a lot of states that aren't quite where Florida is. So it becomes a relatively weird conversation when the criticism starts to be launched at Florida, when there are states that we could be looking at where we could actually move things forward. But for me, that just goes back to this fundamental conversation about how are we holding up democracy as this sacred entity. So much of our conversation, I think Michael had mentioned it, I'm an Ohio State fan. It reminds me of Ohio State, Michigan fans fighting back and forth. And it's like, where are the refs? Who is the authority here who we can look to know they are fighting for democracy itself?
Mm-hmm. Well, my mother-in-law is an Ohio State alum, so you got points with her.
That is good to hear. She sounds like a wonderful person.
The Michigan grad, you don't get them with me, however.
You win some, you lose some.
Yeah. So, but Neil, if I can follow up with you, what needs to happen there? Is this a role for philanthropy? Is this something that needs to happen through legislation, litigation? What are the prospects for being able to address the specifically monetary elements? Because when that bill passed, people started referring to it as a new poll tax. What needs to happen in order to restore the possibility of people who have been now prohibited, the possibility of them being able to vote again?
Yeah, one, I think we need to be laser focused on the simple moral truth that we need to get rid of all financial barriers to voting. And so in the state of Florida, that means that there's a couple paths forward. One is we are literally working to pay people's financial obligations. It sucks to have to say that. Sorry, I know we're in it's horrible to have to say that, that we actually have to try and pay people's fines and fees. In Florida, under the law that was passed to implement Amendment 4, we also have access to the courts. So people can actually get their sentences modified. So we have now begun, now that there's legal clarity, to operationalize the new law. And we've gone into the local courts and we've seen people get their sentences modified to the point where just a couple of weeks ago, there was a gentleman that got $88,000 that he owed wiped away by the judge. He's now eligible to vote. We see people in other the judicial districts getting their sentences modified to community service. So we actually feel like there's a real opportunity to engage the court system in Florida to get tens of thousands of people eligible to vote simply by getting their sentences modified. But the truth is we need to build more public support to change the policy itself through the legislature or through our clemency board in Florida. So there's really 4 pathways forward that we see on a very practical level in terms of how do we focus on these 700,000+ people who are not yet eligible. The lifetime ban is gone, but they, owe 100, they owe 1,000, they owe $10,000, and until that barrier is removed, they're not going to be eligible to vote. But for us, those are the 4 pathways, and that is what we're working on. We're actively working to pay people's fines directly. We're actively working to get them modified in the court system. We're working to change the law, and we're working to engage the clemency board, who does have the power to actually grant everybody their voting eligibility if those 4 elected officials wanted to do that.
But I want to go back just a bit to something I think is important that Neil said. I mean, 64% of the folks in Florida voted for this. Now, think about that. Where can you get 64% of Americans to agree on almost anything? 64%. This is Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, progressives, liberals, and yet it's not what they voted for is not in place because a legislature, probably looking at this population of people who would now have the right to vote, their fear was they would not be supportive of that party. And so the Republican Party in Florida decided, in essence, to overturn the will of the people, disenfranchise or continue to disenfranchise people on a policy that has a very ugly history. And so that's consistent with what I was saying earlier about significant portions of that party doing anti-democratic things. I don't mean Democratic Party, well, it was anti-democratic party, but anti-democracy, anti-democracy things, especially in the face of that, where 64% of the people in that state said, you know what, this is a good thing. This is what we ought to do.
Well, I'm sorry, what were you going to say, Neil?
No, I was just going to say.
I was just going to wave my flag there because I think you're right. I mean, 1 million+ Republicans voted for this, millions of independents, Democrats, 64% is a lot. And it was a people voted their morals, people voted their values, and to see how this kind of played out, just is a reminder that you take some steps forward and you take some steps backwards at the same time, right?
Mm-hmm. What's interesting, one, how many of these laws, date back to Jim Crow, specific Jim Crow policies and disenfranchisement projects. But the thing about that's notable to me is that we conceive of this as a problem of the South or a problem of the former regions in which there was Jim Crow and formal exclusion, which was never entirely accurate, but a preponderance of this problem we could see there. That's not where we are now. We're looking at in 2020, one of the most heated areas in which this was being contested was Wisconsin, which was a state that fought for the Union, and we're seeing these things happen in Michigan and Ohio, suits in New York State, and places that are not at all kind of associated with what we think about when we think about Selma or Martin Luther King or the march to Selma to Montgomery March and so on. How did this problem metastasize in the way that it has outside of that region of the country into all of these other places, North and South Dakota, just all over the country? And I wonder, anyone who wants to weigh in on that.
Well, I think in some respects that the key moment may have been at around 3 a.m. on that first night after the 2000 election, when people realized, good heavens, this system is really ramshackle. This country is really divided, and that suppressing a few votes here or there, or for that matter, mobilizing a few votes here or there, can really make the difference. And many of the trends that have reached such dire state, I would say, right now, really were present over the last 20 years. People forget that there was a significant scandal at the United States Justice Department under the George W. Bush presidency, where prosecutors who refused to bring voter fraud charges against non-existent voter fraud were fired. And then when it was publicly revealed, the Attorney General of the United States had to resign. That's kind of gone down the memory hole, but this is a way people are kind of grappling for partisan advantage. And I do think that another state where it's quite significant is a place like Arizona, where the phony audit designed to undermine confidence in the election has been happening, or states like Michigan and Pennsylvania that are divided on partisan terms, where these issues of our democracy, and I agree with Attorney General Holder that there's a direct assault on the legitimacy of our democratic institutions, are now the sum and substance of a lot of political debate. And I do think also that is something new and disturbing.
Jelani, if I could just add, I mean, Michael is right that since Bush v. Gore, the level of efforts to manipulate the system has just risen exponentially. But I think that the trend that you were describing has long been embedded in American politics, and that I think if any scholar of voting rights will tell you that racially polarized voting, which is when people vote against the other person because of their race, exists in a widespread pattern across, in fact, also across both parties, I should add, and that you could see it in many places. It was less extreme, more extreme in some places or another, but it was everywhere, and it's the reason why when I was just a plain old scholar, I actually argued that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act should be applied nationwide. Because for exactly the reason that you identified, that the idea that these pockets are only in one place is just not true. They happen in many places, and the protections that Section 5 affords voters of color should exist everywhere. So I think you were right to point it out, and it's not surprising that we're seeing it manifest itself this way.
I think the dean makes a really good point. If Chief Justice Roberts had said, America has changed, and what we really need to have is a Voting Rights Act that applies beyond the traditional Confederate states, but to the nation as a whole, I would have said, you're absolutely right, because as you point out, Jelani, these are concerns out that are not restricted to Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina. It is Michigan, Wisconsin, the upper Midwest, Arizona. This is something that's nationwide. I think Michael's point is a good one. Yeah, that everything I think has been on steroids since the change of the millennium. The dean is correct. This has been a theme we've seen in our politics. Bush v. Gore. All right, you come out of that and you say, well, all right, we see some techniques now. We see the ability, what happens if you keep certain numbers of people from voting. Then the election of Barack Obama and the potential rise of the Obama coalition. So you've got techniques, and then you've got the fear, the fear that is fueled by the rise of the multiracial and young, diverse Obama coalition that really, I think, infuses in people who opponents of democracy. They've got the techniques, and now they've got the reasons, the fuel to try to get more people on board.
Now, I'll just note that the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, in fact, did or would, I hope will, apply Section 5 nationwide with a different coverage formula that is less mechanistic, but would not be limited merely to the states of the past.
The interesting thing about this is that we've talked about this in the context of civil rights and the civil rights movement, specifically around African Americans and access to the right to vote. But I think that people don't necessarily know, at least the public doesn't necessarily know, just how many groups are impacted and enfranchised by the Voting Rights Act. And I wondered if anyone would be willing to talk about that, as it relates to immigrant communities or indigenous communities or anyone else.
Well, can I just jump back in a little bit to what you were saying and kind of touch on your point? And again, I know we've got legal scholars on the conversation, and I come from a little bit of a different place, but I think culturally we're in this place where it's very challenging to kind of dive into the concept of how do we see each other, because if you do look at like Bush v. Gore and how we move forward as a society, I think there's real challenges in terms of seeing somebody as the enemy, right? Like we look at the other side as all the good people are on one side, all the good people are on the bad side. That's a really challenging environment for us to find ourselves in. I think about South Carolina in 2016 on the Republican side, where on one stage was Marco Rubio, Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, and Trey Gowdy, right? A version on the right that says, hey, we want to march into the future this way. And I think we all know what was on the other side, right? Somebody who had just announced that nobody with a Muslim background could come into this country, and a demonization machine that really did feed into this idea that we're scared of each other. And so I think that plays into kind of, once you see how tools can be used, like everybody here has mentioned, Bush v. Gore kind of showed the roadmap, right? Like with just a little bit of emphasis here or there. I mean, can you imagine if Al Gore had behaved like Donald Trump, or Bill Clinton, I should say, President Clinton? I mean, where would we be right now? But I think culturally, we're now in a much scarier place. And these kind of legal mechanisms have been shown to be very effective for folks like Donald Trump who want to use them. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but I do think there's a cultural component to this entire story as well.
Yeah.
A person who's technically from Queens, but we don't talk about that.
Not my part of Queens.
Not my part of Queens, actually. I just say that's a different part of Queens. But I mean, I want to go with that a little bit further, though. When we talk about, on the one side, this conversation about a public willing to countenance egregious, belligerent, and overt racist appeals, xenophobic appeals, misogynistic appeals, and some other things that we've seen kind of baked into this formula. And on the other side, things that don't seem to have any sort of political penalty attached to them, for that kind of behavior. So the cultural part of it is really interesting. But on the other side of it, there's polling. When we say that there's suppression that's happening, there's reminiscent of the old style of voter suppression. But on the other side of it, I saw a Monmouth poll from last year that said 80% of Americans support voter ID laws. And so I wonder if what's missing in that conversation and what's not being translated.
You see, I'm a good person there with regard to voter ID laws. I have said for a long time that I'm against certain voter ID laws, those that are designed to keep, certain people away. There's always the Texas example. If you've got a photo ID that says you can carry a gun, that's fine. If you got a state issued photo ID that says you're a student at the University of Texas, that's not good. So it's clear who, they're trying to make it easier for people to vote. But I think the notion of having to prove you are who you claim to be in order to vote, I don't have any problem with that. The question is, why do you have to have it as prescriptively defined as Republicans have done in recent years? You have to have a specific kind of card or something like that. You got to get it from a certain place. That place is only open for a certain number of hours, or you close the offices where you can actually get, the information that it is that you need. I mean, if you say, all right, I mean, this was one of the things I talked, to Senator Manchin about, and why I ultimately came out in favor of the way he had redrawn the bill. If you say you got to prove who you are in order to vote, but there are a number of ways in which you can do it. And I had to do it when I was in Queens, in New York, and show Social Security card, rent receipts. I mean, a whole range of things that would be perfectly acceptable. And so that puts me in that 80% of people who say, yeah, you probably want to have some kind of photo ID. Let's fight about what the ID should be, though, and whether or not it needs to be as narrowly drawn as Republicans have done in a number of states.
If I could, I feel the same way. I'm not against voter ID. I think people need to be who they say they are. And the challenge is just making sure that there's not requirements for ID that lots of people don't have. I would suggest something perversely hopeful in one respect, even insofar as the ugliness and the xenophobia is so evident in so much of this, which is much of this is not new. We have been having this fight from the beginning of the country. From the very beginning, there were people trying to have their voices heard,
Right,
having
sure.
to have that seat at the table, and others fighting just against them. The very first issue, and of course this was when only white men with property were able to vote at the very beginning, and the first fight for voting rights was to eliminate that property requirement so that working class white men could vote, people who would now be Trump supporters in all likelihood. Ironically, I like to quote John Adams, who was urged to get rid of the property requirement when he was writing the Massachusetts Constitution in 1776. And he was aghast. He said, if we do that, women will demand the right to vote. Lads of 18 will demand the right to vote, and men who hath not a farthing to their name will think themselves worthy of an equal voice in government, and they will demand the right to vote. John Adams said, there will be no end of it. And that's basically the history of the country. So in a weird way, that's a hopeful thing, because it's not the first time we've had many immigrants. It's not the first time people have tried to prevent Black people from having their voices heard. And there's been a fight on both sides. And that in some respects, if all we're living through is yet another wave of that great old American fight, that's a weirdly hopeful thing. I worry, though, that there's a new, more authoritarian, more un-American strain loose in the land, and that's what we're grappling with too.
Mm-hmm. Dean Gerkin, I wanted to ask you, how has Yale Law School responded both pedagogically and clinically to the crisis of democracy that you so compellingly talked about earlier?
So, we do an extraordinary amount of work for people in need. If I could bump it up a level of generality, our clinics are pretty remarkable and do a huge amount of work. So just to give you a couple of examples, they've been doing some amazing work on felony disenfranchisement. They've been doing work with the NAACP on prison gerrymandering. It's actually been really inspiring to see, because in some ways they're taking on challenges that I think a lot of lawyers thought were insoluble, and they're making some headway, although I don't want to say it's not getting as far as it should. And then there's just, I would say, I think every law school in the country at this moment is trying to figure out how to rethink everything, the rule of law, our constitutional system, and everything in a way that reflects the current polarized state. Because, I do two kinds of things, election law and federalism. I feel like both of my fields have been completely upended by the levels of enmity and polarization that have sort of swept into the system. So in some ways you look back at the old scholarship in election law, and I call it playing cards in a hurricane. You're worried about, what about this campaign finance law, and what about this? And there's a hurricane blowing that's threatening to topple the system. I think that is the great challenge for the American legal system and the rule of law, and that is a question that I suspect everyone in this Zoom, every institution in the country is trying to sort of think through, because it's not just the kind of day-to-day work of voting rights work, which Michael's one of the great leaders on it, as is General Holder, as is Neil, but also just really figuring out how we're going to hold the country together as the hurricane forces of polarization blow through.
Mm-hmm. Honestly, it's interesting to hear you say that, because those are the same sorts of questions that come up in the journalism school where I teach, and I think one of the ways I think we could gauge how significant this crisis is the number of institutions that have had to rethink who they are and what they do. And in the case of journalism, that's been very awkward, and something that's been done in public with a rightful chorus of criticism around what people have gotten wrong. I do want to ask you one other thing, though. Do you think there's more that institutions of higher learning could be doing, maybe beyond law schools, or just in general? How do you see us, if I can ask a 10,000-foot question, how do you see the role of universities in this moment of democratic crisis?
It's a great question, and maybe I could say it this way. Typically, universities try to maintain a steady distance from the world, and part of their virtue, right, is that they allow for a robust debate. They don't take sides. They pursue truth and so on. And yet I still think you're starting to see institutions realize that there are moments in time when that is not enough. And I could give you a good example, which is in the wake of January 6th. The deans of law schools, typically when we talk together, we talk about sort of the conventional things that deans talk about. We sign letters to the ABA, and we talk about what kind of rules we want to sort of govern legal education. But we did something very unusual in the wake of January 6th. It was something that to the best of our knowledge, hasn't really happened since Watergate. So in Watergate, about 20 sort of schools signed a letter about the rule of law in Watergate. And amazingly, and I really say will emphasize amazingly, almost all the deans in the country signed a letter about the relationship between the rule of law, the values of our profession, and what occurred on January 6th and the role that lawyers played in it. And I was very much involved in that. So not only did we have to figure out something that we could all agree on, and I should just emphasize, the deans of red state flagship schools signed it. The deans of small, very conservative institutions signed it. I'm not under any illusions that Yale Law School signing something is really going to change the zeitgeist, but the fact that so many deans from so many different places with so many constituencies were able to sign something fundamental about the values of the profession really mattered. I will also just note the fact that it was able to survive line editing by 140 deans is also no mean feat. It did take up a lot of that one weekend, but I just think those are the kinds of moments that higher education is occasionally called on. The dilemma, as you know, Jelani, right, is that you can't play this game all the time, right? The more often you dive in, the less weight it carries when you do something. So the fact that this was such a rare event really mattered in terms of the way that deans were doing it. But it's a dilemma, especially in kind of a world of statement generation that we see. Law schools and universities can only carry weight if they do this in a careful, assiduously nonpartisan way, and that makes it almost impossibly hard to know when to act and when to not. I mean, we all spend all our time talking about these kinds of questions around elections.
I mean, I think that honestly, you could, and the historian in me thinks this way, you could write a pretty interesting history of the past decade using only as your primary sources the public letters, the open letters that have been signed by different groups of people. It seems to me that we've seen an astounding number of letters and editorials from people who are generally above the fray, and all the newspaper editors at one time signing on to letters about what was happening in terms of the creep of authoritarianism in this country, and military figures, former military figures, people who never sign letters or write anything publicly, and all of a sudden we're inundated with them. And so I think that's really interesting. Before we wrap up, I do want to kind of do another round robin question about what you think have been the most important successes, because I know people here, you could be listening to this and just be sinking lower and lower into your seat, given the scale of the problems we're confronting. But I wonder if we could go in the same order of Neil, Michael, Heather, and Eric, in terms of the successes, or at least the potential successes that you see in the landscape now.
Excellent. I can't believe we're already at that point. So thank you for that question. And I'm almost go back to what Michael was talking about with kind of John Adams and kind of his litany of, oh, if we do this, we do that, then other people are going to vote. I feel like when I think about successes, and again, I have my own kind of narrative and biases because the community that I work in, I look at across the country over recent years, and much of the expansion of democracy has actually come out of the leadership of people impacted by the criminal justice system. So I look at it, Tara and the state of Washington, and Dorsey in California, and Norris in Louisiana, and Darrell in North Carolina, Desmond in Florida, right? And you see this move, this expansion of democracy that gives me hope. I think there's something there where there's the best evangelists for democracy sometimes can be people who lost it and got it back, people who were kicked to the curb of society and know what it's like to be outside, who can call us to our higher angels, can convince us that we all have fundamental dignity and a belief in this thing called democracy. And so to see that in action in state after state after state gives me a lot of hope, because we've seen people move. We've seen that there's this something in us, deep in us, that believes in this, that believes that this is sacred and is willing to fight for it. But I think, man, we have some headwinds You know, we've got people who are scared, people who are fearful, people who are willing to believe things that simply aren't true. But deep down, I believe that we collectively have an understanding around human dignity and the expression of each individual person in society, that it gives me hope, because I've seen it happen firsthand in Florida, and I've seen it across the country. So I'm really grateful to be a part of this conversation. And thanks for letting me take part.
I have to say too, that what gives me hope in a sense is that we're talking about this, but not only us, but many, many millions of people really care about these issues that once might have been just the province of experts. In addition to what you saw in Florida, what Neil and Desmond did, in 2018, there were ballot initiatives for redistricting reform done by citizens in 4 states, automatic voter registration passed, all other kinds of things, reflecting an understanding that people have of how central this is to who we are as a country. So I, as scary as the moment is, and as scary as, again, to me, the rise of the big lie movement is, there's a democracy movement perhaps as well that is going to make itself felt. And that is, I hope, a source for hope.
So those are both extraordinarily inspiring. And so maybe I'll talk a little bit about this, sort of what I think are the unsung heroes of the last round of election, which is election administrators and a lot of judges. You know, a lot of election administrators and a lot of judges put aside their partisan bias, put aside their partisan inclinations. They called them as they saw them. They really tried to do their job, and in keeping with the values of their own professions. And you know, that is something we expect of people, but it's become to a point, it's almost heroic to see someone who is able to sort of set aside their political tribe and actually just do what's right, and to do their job, and to take pride in the standards that they use. So I just want to give them a shout out, because I found that really inspiring in the last round.
Yeah, I guess what gives me hope is that I think the consciousness of the nation has been raised, that people around the country, and this is irrespective of race, you know, party, to a large extent party, socioeconomic, you know, background, people are focusing on these democracy issues. And I think that, you know, Michael's point is a good one. When you give the people, and what Neil said as well, when we give the people the opportunity to make determinations about the direction of our nation, they're always voting for democracy. They're always trying to make our system of voting more fair, make it easier, expand ways in which people have the ability to vote. And I think at the end of the day, that's probably a tide that can't be reversed. And so that's what gives me hope. You know, I've got a commercial break here. I have a book coming out. On May the 10th, and it's interesting. It's called Our Unfinished March, and it's interesting only, well, hopefully it's interesting in a lot of ways, but what Michael said about, you know, the first chapter is about white men getting the vote, white men getting the vote. And we have in there that quote from, you know, from John Adams, the Benjamin Franklin retort. You know, 6% of adults in the country voted in the first election that put George Washington, has made George Washington our first president. And so, you know, we have generally been on an arc that we've expanded the ability of people to vote, included more people. This is a tough time. But I think that rise in consciousness and this notion that people have that in order to make it better, get it to a place where it is better, that we're going to have to work for it. I think that people have that sense. And I saw it, you know, we announced that anti-gerrymandering effort back in January of 2017. And boy, people's eyes would glaze over when I started talking about partisan and racial gerrymandering. And now I think people tend to get it, you know, that, you know, it's not just some kind of thing about how you draw the lines. It has an impact on issues that people care about: reproductive freedoms, you know, expansion of voting rights, criminal justice reform, a whole range of things. And I think that we are becoming, in a good way, a more political people and a more focused on democracy people.
Okay, I have 2 questions I left out. So before we wrap up, I do want to get to these. Should the Supreme Court be expanded to 13 seats to match the number of circuit courts? Anyone?
Well, I think that's a logical way. I mean, I think the last expansion was in order to match the number of seats with the number of courts of appeal that we had. And I don't know if it's partisan or not, but I don't think we can ignore the way in which the last, excluding the justice who's now being considered a potential justice, but there's 2 seats before that, the way in which they were filled, and the impact that has had. So yeah, I think that court expansion is something that ought to happen, and also limiting the number of years that you can serve, on the court. One of the things I talk about again in this book is to have 18-year terms. Every president gets the ability in his or her first and third terms to appoint a justice, and that way you'd have people. The court size would then be 9, and you would have people cycling off every 18 years, and potentially that decreases the pressure for justices to retire at a certain time, and certainly maybe we wouldn't have confirmation hearings, like the one we just had to endure.
Yeah, well, it's like the Jets and the Sharks now. What were you going to say, Michael?
I was going to say Dean Gerkin and I were both commissioners on the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court, which was instructed not to come to any conclusions and followed its instructions excellently. But one of the things that was really striking and interesting is that in the public hearings, almost all the witnesses of left and right, who certainly differed on court expansion or other issues like that, supported term limits of some kind. And there is actually a potential consensus there in an interesting way that could unfold.
It's not just a bipartisan consensus. It's also just that we are a complete outlier compared to the rest of the world. No sort of established democracy thinks that this is a good idea. Not even the states think this is the United States of America. The states of the United States of America think this is a good idea. And General Holder, I mean, his proposal is similar to the one that the Biden Commission talked about at length, but it captures this proposition that judges should not be driven by a particular political interest or partisanship or anything like that. You want to shield judges from those things. But over time, there is an expectation that by allowing presidents to appoint the same number of appointees over time, that you'll ensure that in a broad way, the court is moving in a fashion that is in keeping with where our democracy is moving. So the term limit proposal is a nice way of threading that needle.
And the last thing that I will ask is, specifically for Michael and Eric, we have seen in the aftermath of 2020 a whole slate of laws that have moved control and power over elections out of the hands of secretaries of state and into the hands of state legislatures. How concerned should people be about that?
Well, I'd say very concerned, and what I would echo here is what Dean Gerkin was saying. That we had as heroes and heroines in 2020, judges, secretaries of state, who simply did the right thing, irrespective of party. Republicans, and especially Republicans. Brad Raffensperger, I might have all kinds of problems with things that he's done when it comes to expanding the right to vote, suppressing the vote. I suspect we don't share a worldview, and yet he did the right thing when it came to the count of the vote there, resisted that pressure, and it may cost him his political career, and so those people, and then people at much lower levels, just doing things, Republicans again and Democrats, just trying to count the votes in the right way, certifying the votes in ways that they sacrifice. Those are people I think who need to be lifted up, and putting responsibility for this into partisan legislatures, I think is a very, 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 very dangerous thing. And it's something that I think has to be resisted at all costs.
Yes, it is election subversion on top of voter suppression. And we're seeing it in some of the legislative proposals in states. We're also seeing it in the attacks on election officials, as Dean Gerkin described, the unsung, increasingly sung, but unsung heroes of this we've been doing surveys of election officials in recent months and found that a very large number of them are being threatened, are thinking of leaving their jobs. These are not people who are in this for the big bucks. These are not the glamour jobs, and they're facing extraordinary opprobrium. And far too often, these new state laws actually target them as well. In Texas, for example, we represent some local election officials who've managed so far to successfully challenge the state law there that imposes criminal penalties on election officials in counties who do too much to help people get absentee ballots. That's an example. So I think that is something that really ought to be universally a challenge, irrespective of political view. That again has a whiff of authoritarianism that is different from some of the stuff we've seen before.
Mm-hmm. So we're a little bit early, but I want to thank everyone for their participation and for your insights. If there's anything that you want to share at this point, the floor is yours. And final comments.
Well, let me just say, I'd like to thank Neil, Dean Gerkin, Michael, and Jelani, you for participating in this conversation. I think it was interesting. I hope that people will leave from it maybe a little better informed and maybe a little more inclined to participate, as I said, in this fight for our democracy. I mean, I think, again, this is the most important thing that faces this nation. What kind of nation are we going to have going forward? What kind of democracy are we going to have going forward? Positive change is not promised. It only happens as a result of work, of dedication, of commitment, of sacrifice. And I think that, with the leaders that we have here on the screen and countless others, that we can get to that better place. And that's ultimately why I'm kind of optimistic. As I say, I looked at the history of voting in this nation, and I think we're still on that arc, that good arc. But that arc has only been good because people have fought to make it good, and so that's what I think we have to continue to do.
Well, I will say by way of closing, a point that connects a number of things, which is that as a kind of theme here, I'm from Queens, but my father was from a small place called Hazelhurst, Georgia. And he grew up at a time when my earliest memories, in fact, was the 1976 election, where my father walked down to the local polling place, which was a couple of blocks from our home and on Hollis Avenue, and took me into the poll with him. I was 6 years old, took me into the polling place with him, showed me what he was doing, who he was voting for. He was voting for his fellow Georgian, Jimmy Carter, in the presidential election of that year. And as a small child, I didn't understand the importance of that act, but I later recognized that my father, had he attempted to vote in his native Georgia, when he was a young man, would have likely or potentially lost his life. That arc has come a full circle, at least it did in 2008, when we went from him not being able to vote to him voting and taking me to vote with him as a child, to 2008, when I served as a delegate in Georgia for the nomination of the candidate who went on to become the first Black president of the United States, Barack Obama. And so that is the anecdotal information. And it is important, Mark Morial, told me once that it is important that we keep in mind those stories, the individual narratives that keep us inspired to fight for the bigger, more collective victories. And so I want to, with that, to thank Neil, thank Michael, thank Eric, thank Heather, and to thank the audience for staying with us and participating, as well as thanking the Eric Holder Jr. Initiative at Columbia University for sponsoring this.